how you better feel.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to start. My name is Carin. I work at the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Geneva. It's a Canadian think tank, but I'm based in our office in Geneva. I'd like to thank very much ICRD 2017 and CDE for inviting me to moderate today's session. Today's theme is about governance of conflicted natural resources, a very important and topical theme. On the way this morning, I was reading a 2016 UNEP report from their International Resources Panel that has found that natural resource extraction has more than tripled over the past 4 decades. And not only has it more than tripled, but the consumption of those natural resources are extremely unevenly distributed, with rich countries consuming on average 10 times more natural resources than the poorest countries. Furthermore, our very resource-intensive pattern of consumption has not only resulted in growing inequalities, but has led to serious environmental damage and conflict. These are all themes that are being explored in ICRD 2017, and I think it's really important that all these themes are being explored in a very holistic way in this conference. For many of the speakers in today's sessions, it's the global land grab that has most poignantly illustrated this conflict over natural resources and the competition over natural resources. One of the starkest reports I read, having worked on this issue now for a few years, was a Human Rights Watch report that found that 1.5 million people in Ethiopia are at risk of being resettled to make way for land investments. I think it's therefore inspiring, given this reality, that the world got together and adopted Agenda 2030. But the gap between what we see written in Agenda 2030 and that vision for a more sustainable and equitable world and the reality is great. Our 2 keynote speakers today, Borras and Ellis, are going to give us quite different pictures of if and how we can bridge that gap between the reality we're currently in and the vision that we have from Agenda 2030. I'm going to first start and give the floor to Professor Ellis to share his vision. Professor Erle Ellis works at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County in the Geography and Environmental Systems Division. His research has focused on the ecology of human landscapes at both local and global scales, trying to help inform a vision towards the sustainable stewardship of the biosphere. Your presentation today, Professor Erle, is going to be about how you think a radical increase in the scale and effectiveness of conservation efforts for natural resources can help save our planet. As you share these ideas, it would be great if you could give us some concrete examples of how and where this is already happening to help inspire us towards this vision. Thank you. Housekeeping rules before I pass over. Sorry, stay with me. We have people watching in the room today with us, but we also have people watching at a distance online. The way we're going to handle questions or comments is via Slido. A lot of you are familiar with this from yesterday's session, but basically if you have a comment or a question, please send it to slido.com. The code is ICRD 2017, and after our keynote speeches and our debaters' interventions, we're going to share some of these questions. So please feel free, as the speeches are being made, to send in your questions, comments. For those who are tweeting, please remember to do hashtag ICRD 2017 in your tweets, and we encourage people to tweet as much as possible. Okay, now over to you.
All right, thank you. Do I hold this or do I just use the mic?
As you like.
I think I'll use that. Let me start the talk here. Function F5. Perfect. You have a clicker. Okay, I'll just use this thing here. Good. All right, good morning. Thank you very much. Thank you, Thomas Broy, for inviting me, and for the organizers, of course, for hosting this. And I can say I'm an ecologist primarily, although I do work at global scales, just global ecology, and I'm out of my natural habitat here. This is not usually the group that I'm talking to. But let's have a go. And I'm actually not going to talk about natural resources in general. I'm going to specifically talk about the terrestrial biosphere, biodiversity, and at least on land, the actual area of conserved habitat that is relevant to conserving biodiversity. And I'll start off with just work that just frames the picture for me, which is this concept of the Anthropocene and this idea that we now live in a time period on this planet where everything is going to be affected by what we do. There's not an option for a people don't affect the environment scenario in the future. Then we'll talk about what I call the cultures of nature, or the fact that the way that we live, the way that our cultures shape what we do, transforms the environment. And then some of the opportunities that come out of that. Of course, there's lots of difficulties and challenges, but there's also some opportunities in the way that we use land. And then finally, toward a different way of thinking. I'm kind of tired of the technocracy of biodiversity and ecology, explaining to everyone what biodiversity has to be conserved, et cetera. If we don't have this coming from the bottom up, people want to do this. People understand the vision. People are doing what they believe in to conserve biodiversity. It's going to stay a technocracy, and it's going to stay a small-scale phenomena that is not going to reach the scale of the problem that we need to solve. The Anthropocene, you've all seen this slide before, right? This is the Earth glowing at space as seen from a satellite. Everyone's kind of probably bored of seeing this thing, but I think it is still one of the best ways of visualizing the Anthropocene for a simple reason. Did anybody try to make the Earth glow at night? Right? This is it's a symptomatic effect of human societies interacting together over generations, accomplishing their own purposes, and having secondary effects that nobody thought of. Now the planet glows at night. It never did before. Is this anything that anybody can change? Can any of you turn this off? Is it possible to turn the lights off? People try. There's actually a program to try to turn the lights off at night. They can't do it. This is what the Anthropocene is about. It's this emergent social phenomenon, completely caused by human beings, that we are not in control of. And I would argue that the better future of this planet is when we can moderate those lights as a whole. So it's very easy to think of the Anthropocene as a crisis, and it's appropriate to think of it as a crisis. We are changing the planet faster and in ways that we don't understand than we ever have before. So it's completely valid to think about this. And we have new challenges like the potential for a sixth mass extinction, for the loss of half or more of the biodiversity of life on Earth. And this is obviously something that any, I think, rational, even, as I'll make the point, even irrational people don't want this to happen. This is not just a technocratic problem. This is a problem nobody wants to happen. Just like those lights at night, it's a secondary effect. Nobody's trying to wipe out life on Earth, but we're starting to do this. So, another thing to think about, and very important for the Anthropocene, everyone thinks it's just this recent thing, and there's a real tendency to think, oh, the Anthropocene began in 1950 when humans really started changing things. Well, you look a little deeper under that Amazonian deforestation, and in a lot of places you see the fact that humans have been transforming this planet for thousands of years, not for 50 years or hundreds of years. We've been doing this since ancient times. We began, maybe one of the very first signatures of human transformation of the biosphere is the megafauna extinctions, the extinctions of the very large carnivores and herbivores by Paleolithic hunter-gatherers operating with no more than collective social skills and stone-tipped projectiles and fire and environmental modification. That was enough to begin the process of transforming the biosphere. And we've continued to do this for thousands of years through agriculture. As I'll note, agriculture is the single biggest thing we've done to this planet. We all are talking about the concerns about global warming caused by emissions of carbon dioxide and methane from fossil fuel combustion. And this is accelerating dramatically human impacts. And someday, probably inevitably at this point, we're going to see this become the biggest effect that humans have ever had. But actually, to date, the biggest transformation of Earth's biosphere and the Earth system as a whole has come from agriculture. And so we know the global patterns of life that we all think about, the biomes, right? The fact that we have tropical rainforests in the warm and wet areas, the global patterns shaped by the natural climate system are no longer a relevant way of thinking about the entire Earth and its biosphere because we've transformed it. About 40% of Earth's land is now currently in use for crops, pastures, and settlements, and human infrastructure. This is a huge transformation of Earth. So we need to think not just in terms of saving wild, natural places, but we need to think about the fact that the nature that we now have is embedded within anthropogenic biomes, the human-formed landscapes that we now have shaped across the Earth. And I'll give you a very brief tour of what these look like. But these anthropogenic biomes are really what we have left. And one of those parts, of course, is still we have some areas of the Earth that we do not have permanent human settlements, we do not have land use, and most of them look something like this. Some area that's too cold, too dry, too remote, and unproductive for people to have gotten there to use it. People aren't really interested in these places. As you'll find, I'll say a little bit later, when we talk about conservation, it's usually places like this in terms of global extent, places people didn't already want. It's about a quarter of Earth's terrestrial surface now, ice-free land. Much bigger is the area of SemiNatural lands. These are lands that are very partially used. There's some human settlement, there's some land use, but it's not that extensive. It's not definitive. The natural patterns still shine through. But large areas of this are recovery. For example, a lot of Amazonia. It may look totally wild, but actually it's recovered from a previous use. Rangelands, very extensive areas, right, dominated by human use for pastures and livestock, relatively sparsely settled. Croplands, when we think of croplands, some people are talking about croplands and thinking about them just as crops. But in fact, huge amounts of human population lives in croplands. And croplands are mosaics. They include trees, They include settlements. They're not just crops. Villages, the densely populated agricultural lands of the world. Almost, well, this is from 2000. I think it's changed substantially even since 2000. But almost half of the world's people live in these densely populated agricultural regions that we call village anthropogenic biomes. And then, of course, the urban settlements. And this is actually a pretty small area. Even today, less than 2% of Earth's land, probably between 1 and 2%, and a relatively small area. And so what does the biosphere look like with people in it? Well, about 80% of the people on Earth live in the densely populated urban and village anthromes. So we're pretty concentrated. About a quarter of the terrestrial biosphere is still in this state of wildlands, and about 3/4 in some form of human transformed landscape and anthropogenic biome. Note that current extent of wild forests is less than the current extent of villages and urban settlements. So if you're interested in ecology, as I am, we have to think about those places as really critical parts of our Earth's ecology. When we think about the energy that drives life on Earth, the net primary production of plants, that's even more lopsided, and it's for the reason I showed. The areas that are still left wild are mostly the least productive areas of Earth. So most of the primary production of Earth is now going on, or on land, sorry, is now going on within the anthropogenic biomes. And just to give you another idea about this that I find very important, only about 20% of Earth's tree cover is within wildlands, but a full quarter of Earth's tree cover is embedded within croplands. So if you're interested in forests, we need to think about croplands. If we look at what the biosphere looks like, the biosphere that we have left, we don't have this wild place out there to conserve. This is the biosphere that we have. We have about a quarter that's still in this state we could call wild. It might not actually be that way, but that's a relatively simple state. And about 40% is currently in use. It's directly in use for crops, pastures, and settlements. But the interesting thing is there's also this area in between. And that area in between, in my opinion, is the great opportunity of the Anthropocene. What are we going to do better with the lands that are left embedded within our used landscapes but are not currently being used intensively? What can we do with those? And the reason that we have them, and I think it's obvious to everyone who looks out of a window or an airplane, what you see out there is that people don't use everything. People generally don't do everything wall to wall. Like there are some regions of the Earth, just croplands, or just crops, sorry, just pasture. But generally you see a mix, a mosaic of used and less used areas that are also transformed by human activity. They may have already been used in the past and recovered. They may just be changed by the fact that they've been left embedded within a used landscape, but they are ecologically different than what you had before. These novel ecosystems are present all over the world. They are present especially in places where you have either, they're present wherever you have some use of the land. If land is completely used, you don't see any of these, of course. And in places where you have wildlands, of course, you don't have so much novel ecosystem. But they look like many different kinds of things. But just to give you an idea of what one might look like, this is one from China. And I'm going to talk a lot about China because it's a place I've spent more time working on the ground on ecology. This is what a forest would look like there, or a woodland. Something managed by many different households in many different ways for many different purposes. And if you want to understand the ecology of a woodland, a novel woodland, you need to understand the social processes that have created it and maintain it. And this is my most technocratic slide. One critical thing to think about, we always talk about species loss, and we should be concerned about it because an extinction is a permanent thing, or at least it is today, and it's something to be avoided. But there's another, even more profound transformation of the biosphere that is also going on at the same time, and that is species gains. And this is mostly by species invasion, and it has increased biodiversity in most landscapes. Most landscapes occupied by people have more species than they did before. That is not a good thing, but it is a fact. It makes the concept of biodiversity very complicated, in fact, and very value-laden. Which species do you care about? It's not just more species. Having more is not just good. But that's important for understanding the fact that we have to think a little differently about what we're going to conserve in the future. So we've transformed ecosystems all over the world, and this is livestock grazing in Tanzania. But this is going on in a mixed-use landscape that is the most biodiverse for mammal megafauna in the world. If you want to see the most intact megafauna assemblages left in the world, you need to go to Africa, and you need to go to some of these mixed-use landscapes. Multifunctional landscapes, doing more than one thing, can be good. It's not so simple as a one-way street. Humans destroy. That is the classic concept that ecologists often are responsible for promoting, but not universally. There's others too. This idea that there's this natural planet, and it's just disturbed by people. Humans are just wrecking this thing. When in fact, for thousands of years, we have been transforming ecology. The nature that we have is now embedded within our societies. There's not this nature out there, separate. It's all within our society. So what are we going to do better with this? Because in the Anthropocene, environmental change is social change. And social change, over the long term, is cultural change. And where are we going with this? Well, the planet that we're currently shaping is the most connected planet in the history of the Earth. It is now possible to communicate in real time across the entire planet with other people. That is an incredible capacity. We transfer goods, services, ecology, water, whatever. It's all going around the planet. That is the planet we're creating. We are creating an urban planet. People are moving to the city. We have an urbanizing planet, and it is changing everything. The idea that urbanization is about cities is really misunderstanding urbanization. Urbanization is about creating an entirely different form of social system. And that social system is changing the whole planet. Large-scale urban societies are not fed by small farmers. They're fed by really large-scale producers. It's almost impossible to urbanize on small farming, right? It's done mostly at larger scales. And there's some good news about that, right? A lot of people are just down on larger scale, more intensive agriculture, but it's been responsible for the fact that there's now more food per person produced on Earth than there was before. So as populations have gone up, the amount of food per person has gone up. Not necessarily people getting access to that food, that's a different question, but the food production itself is no longer the number one issue for getting fed. It's not about production. And in fact, we've done this using about the same amount of land. Land use has not expanded radically, except for pastures. Pastures has expanded somewhat radically, but that's possible to change actually more easily too. But for croplands, arable cropland hasn't increased a huge amount, even as we've increased food availability per person. And I can say that nobody wants to go back to being the poor farmer. Once you've gotten to that one side, and this is I always show this slide if I can. Most of you can guess. Anyone who can read Chinese knows immediately what this is, but I think you can all guess. It's an advertisement for chemical fertilizer. It's actually the first advertisement successful in China at selling nitrogen fertilizer. It's called the rich farmer, poor farmer poster for obvious reasons. And the big question about something like this, like you should ask with any advertisement, is this false advertising? Are they just selling you this thing that doesn't really work? Does it not really do that? And the truth is, it does do that. People doubled, tripled their yields instantly with chemical fertilizer back in the 1940s and 50s, okay? It was a transformative effect. It has a lot of secondary effects, right? You add fertilizer, you can get pollution, but the fact is that it made it very easy to increase productivity, and nobody wants to go back to being that poor farmer. There's an opportunity that's come up because of this. When you produce more on the same land and you use a different form of farming system, what happens is you end up not using the same land. People don't want to use this marginal land. They're not going to invest money in lousy land on the hillsides. They're going to invest it in the best land, and a lot of land is now recovering as a result of this. And you can see this also out of any airplane window, especially the United States has got tons of it. China's got tons of this now. A lot of land is recovering. The question is not, can we feed everyone? Because that is possible. No question. The question is, what kind of planet do we really want to live on? What kind of biosphere do we want? And the bigger question even still, is there any we? Is there any bigger vision, collective vision about what the biosphere should look like? Or is it just, let's save a little? It seems to be about as big as the vision we've gotten. And we don't have every option here. We have a used planet. We do not have a planet where everything's kind of wide open. We can just do whatever we want. It's very difficult. We have a planet where climate is changing fast. Species are going to have to move to keep up with their habitats as their habitats migrate north to the cooler regions. Okay, we're making it very hard for biodiversity on Earth. Here is what we do typically to landscapes. We dissect them with our infrastructure. It makes it very hard for other species to move in our landscapes. Can we even manage these anthropogenic mosaics, these anthro-mosaics that we're making, these multifunctional landscapes? It's actually quite hard to do two things well in the same place. It's tough. It's not automatic, right? It's very hard. And so we have to be smart, and we have to actually build in strategies for the rest of life on Earth into the way we develop, into the way we build our infrastructure. It's not possible to have the rest of life on Earth survive the Anthropocene if we don't do that. And it's possible to do it, and we have to start thinking at bigger scales. And for example, we have to think about making it possible for species to move across entire continents. And the good news is that people are starting to do this. A lot of this is emergent. It's not like the UN came up with a strategy for this. It's a bottom-up strategy. People are like, how are these bears going to move up to Canada? How are they going to get there? Going on in Europe as well. These are some of the most densely populated, used landscapes on Earth with some of the most ancient land use. Yet, people are coming up with solutions to put together a very fragmented landscape and connect it together with corridors to actually make it possible for biodiversity to recover. And it is recovering. Nature is strong. Just because you have used the landscape for 1,000 years doesn't mean that it can't recover, doesn't mean that other species can never live there. The wolf is back in Europe. This is a hard animal to live with, right? This isn't quite an elephant, which is a much harder animal to live with, but it is still not an easy animal to live with. Europeans have welcomed this animal back. It is not easy to live with it even now, and it's challenging, but it's coming back. There is a new vision. People are starting to care a lot more about things like wolves. That used to be just a problem. How do you get rid of the wolves used to be what people cared about. Now people have another vision. Let's have a bigger vision for the biosphere. And E.O. Wilson has presented this. It's been presented by others as well, such as Eric Dinerstein. This idea that we should conserve half of the biosphere for the rest of life on Earth. That doesn't necessarily mean pushing people out. It just means we need to manage the biosphere at a scale, a new scale. Right now we're managing about 17% of the terrestrial biosphere is currently in protected lands managed in some way to conserve biodiversity. And you can see what it looks like. It's pretty sparse. It's not enough. It's not going to be enough. If you want a lot of these species to survive the Anthropocene, this is not enough. Okay? We need to think bigger. There's just not enough of the biodiversity of life, enough habitat conserved. Okay, I'm going to just go real quick now. What makes us conserve? Why do it at all? Why not just get rid of the wolves? Biophilia. We actually care about these things. And this biophilia is cultural. It's partly biological, it's partly cultural. It evolves with society as people change the way they aspire to different kinds of nature. And conservation comes out of that. And there are many forms of conservation that are emerging as a result of these new cultures of nature. And I wanted to call that corporate accountability. But these are just some of the many ways. And just as a final closing example here, I've spent a lot of time working in China. China used to be a very, very poor place. One of the poorest places on the planet. That was less than 100 years ago. And the aspirations for nature, even decades ago, this was about it. It'd be nice to have some birds singing in the trees. This is about the extent of it. But things have changed radically. Things are changing fast. The Chinese are getting on board with a whole new way. Why are they doing this? There's a whole new aspiration for nature. It's coming actually, not so simply, and there's some bigger goals, bringing back the tiger, bringing even back the elephant. Did you know that elephants had native habitat across China in historical times, not prehistoric times, historical times? It's urbanization and development that's going to bring those aspirations for nature. That's what's going to drive it. And it's going to even drive new ways of living in the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ellis. I'm going to pass straight on to Borras. I'm not going to try and summarize now. Do you want to come and find your slide while I introduce you? So, Borras, is that working? Yeah. So, Borras is Professor of Agrarian Studies at the International Institute of Social Studies at Erasmus University, Rotterdam, and adjunct professor at the Agricultural University in Beijing. I think probably to this group, he's most well known for his role as the editor-in-chief for the Journal of Peasant Studies and also being a research fellow at the Transnational Institute, TNI. Borras has authored extensively on the global land grab, and he's going to present to us today some of the challenges, the democratic and social justice challenges about natural resource governance with a focus on land. And once again, like I asked Professor Ellis, Professor Borras, if you could give us a sense of whether you think there is progress being made towards more democratic land governance, and if so, how and where, and if not, why? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me here. Part of me just wants to give up my slot, and we just jump in and have a discussion with Erle's presentation, which is fascinating, and I'm sure a lot of issues are up there for discussion. But anyway, mine is a very different kind of thing and much more narrower pitch on a very smaller kind of portion of natural resource politics. Okay, I'll talk about the implications of land rush, the global land rush, which was the culmination of the different sectoral commodity rushes and commodity booms that altogether produced a global kind of rush to have control of land for different reasons as response to the convergence of multiple crises in our planet: food, feed, fuel, climate change, environmental, finance, etc. At its peak, the biggest estimate was that 250 million hectares of land were implicated to the global land rush. It was quite a lot. And that the global land rush brought together a cast of characters, an enormous kind of cast of characters, but I would be talking about three of the biggest clusters of dominant players in the global land rush. One is the state, big time. Two, corporations, domestic and transnational corporations. And third is a bewildering layers of individual opportunists drawn into the global land rush. Land and labor brokers, land entrepreneurs, scammers, swindlers, thieves. They all join this spectacle and the rush to control and grab lands from the villagers, and it's truly global. It's not just in the global south. In some places, they are members of the paramilitary and militia groups. If we think about Colombia or Myanmar, for instance, and they operate normally below the radar of formal institutional monitors, and that makes the challenge for governance even much more difficult. Immediate outcomes, we see big picture, but immediate outcomes as expulsion of villagers from their lands. Carin just talked about Ethiopia, just one country and just one region, Gambela region. 1.5 million people are being relocated so that these lands can be given to corporate investors. Threat of expulsion may be even much more prevalent. And this emerging land concentration, reconcentration more globally. But also we see a lot of villagers incorporated often adversely into most of those emerging capitalist enterprises out of those land deals emerging. The literature has focused on a lot of these immediate outcomes. What I will be focusing more is on the big picture political impacts of this land rush that are less talked about in the literature and in policy debate. And I think it's a useful complement to ongoing studies that focus on land, labor, livelihood impacts of land deals and land rush worldwide. I see about 5 or 6 big picture political impacts of land rush that have very important implications to how we think about democratic governance of natural resources today. First, the global land rush, which revalued land in very different ways and put land at the very center stage again of policy discourse and interest of state and the corporations. First, it strengthened landed classes and the state corporate landed class alliance. they are already inherently opposed to anything democratic natural resource governance. They tend to monopolize control of natural resources, land and associated resources, water, forest, sea, and mineral resources. What the Global Land Russia did is to strengthen those resistance and the interest of landed classes and their alliance with state and big corporations. 2, the Global Land Rush strengthened modernist. What I mean by that is that pro-corporate capital accumulation currents within national states and governments. National states are never homogeneous. We know that there are many different interest groups and policy currents within national governments. Some would emphasize on capital accumulation processes for development progress. Others would emphasize more social justice programs in governments. What the Global Land Rush did, I think, is much more to strengthen and empower the pro-capital accumulation modernist factions within national states and governments, and isolating and marginalizing reform state officials who are more into social justice-oriented reforms. And it paved the way more big-time the inroads for agro-extractivism. 3rd, the Global Land Rush further marginalized, maligned, invisibilized smallholder agriculture and other production systems in the countryside, pastoralism, artisanal fishing, etc. Investments today are made to appear only as those by state and corporations. Rural villagers, peasants, pastoralists, fishers, fish workers, and their massive investments, not only in producing, but in sustaining ecological environments, are made invisible. And much more, they're often being maligned. Disappeared. Okay. In talking about invisibilizing. All right, 4th, it reignited old inter-ethnic tensions and fanned the flames of new ones. We look at all the hotspots of global land rush worldwide, in the global south, in the global north. We see very common pattern. There are latent and overt kind of inter-ethnic tensions. Often they erupt into a fully fledged kind of conflict. Think about the anti-Brazilian sentiments in Paraguay and Santa Cruz in Bolivia. Think about the anti-South African sentiments across the African continent. Think about the anti-Chinese xenophobic tendencies in Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos. It's everywhere, and it's like fanning the flames of new ones. And it challenges even more the task of having a democratic governance on natural resources. 5th, it marginalized, the global land rush marginalized deep social reforms, land reform, land restitution, as old-fashioned and not feasible. Development aid, academic research, NGOs, CSOs, focus more on what is doable within given systems, order, and balance of social forces. And chances are those are way far from deep social reforms that are required by most societies. 6th, and in short, the global land rush altered the balance of social forces and political opportunity structure, POS in the context of Sidney Taro's notion of a political opportunity structure, and marginalized social justice land policies of redistribution, recognition, and restitution, RRR, which I will be talking much about, and divided and weakened rural working poor and their movements that are critical for any global governance. What is to be done? We need system-wide, in my view, dual principles of land size ceiling and minimum farm home lot access, a floor and a ceiling. We need to put a ceiling of how much corporations and individuals can accumulate land. Without that ceiling, if we base just on, you can accumulate as much as you can, sky is the limit, as long as you have the money to buy it, then there will be nothing left for the villagers who cannot compete with corporations and individuals using extra economic coercion or not to gain control over land resources. If we don't put a minimum idea of a minimum access In similar ways, now, these days it's more normal to talk about guaranteed income or minimum, the right to minimum income, and inconceivable decades back. But this is a similar concept of minimum access for farmland. Those who want to work the land have a piece of land to work or live or put their food gardens to have. Those two, I think, are two most important overarching principles. Without that, any notion of social justice land policies are no starters. And even very potentially useful and good instruments like clear cadastral records, consultative processes, multi-stakeholderships, formal private property rights are less useful, and at times could even work against poor people without those overarching kind of social justice principles. The social justice land policies of RRR, redistribution, recognition, and restitution. Recognition. There are many people who still have access to land, but those access are being threatened by all sorts of different political dynamics, the land rush, etc. The task at hand is to protect that existing access through recognition of the rights, whether it's territorial rights or gender, generation, ethnic sensitive policies. And it come into different policy manifestations. Redistribution. There's a mass of landless people who wanted to work the land. There's not much any other option for them to be productive in any other productive sectors of the economy. The task at hand is to promote redistributive land policies, which can come in different policy manifestations of land reform, forest reallocation, tenancy reform, etc. Restitutions. There were many people who were expelled from their land for various reasons, civil wars, land grabs. The task at hand is to restore those lost access to land. These are difficult, delicate, but absolutely necessary balancing act of fundamental issues and contradictions around class and identity politics if land governance is to be genuinely democratic and pro-poor. Some argue that poor people are poor because they are unable to benefit from the market. The task, of course, is to bring the market to the people or bring people to the market. But others argue that poor people are poor precisely because of the very terms of their insertion into those market dynamics. The task, therefore, is to recast the very terms of that insertion. RRR that I'm talking about here is part of the latter point of recasting the terms of poor people's insertion into market dynamics. Collectively, redistribution, recognition, restitution, RRR, aims to recast unjust social structures and the very institutions, formal and informal rules, these created to get themselves perpetually entrenched. Land politics is at the heart of these in societies with important agrarian sectors. RRR reforms, only then can RRR reforms and can facilitate investments of various types that result not only in impressive growth rates, but also in equity and genuinely sustainable practices. RRR is inherently plural in forms in terms of property formats and mechanisms of resource access and use, customary, private, community, collective, etc. An either-or take, something like customary versus private, which is kind of prevalent in some debates, are false dichotomies. In most societies, they coexist. The point is that how do we make a balance so that they actually reinforce one another for a much more kind of positive sum outcomes. RRR will never be achieved through market-based voluntary mechanisms, I'm sorry to say, nor by state corporate partnerships, nor through multi-stakeholdership platforms or consensus building or win-win formula, as history has shown. I'm a little bleak here, but we will have some more redeeming, kind of exciting and interesting things to wrap it up later. RRR is organically linked to class antagonism in societies. To deny this is to deny actually more durable solutions to what ails most societies today. The win of big agribusiness corporations is rarely a win for peasants or, of societies. Think of large-scale industrial mechanized oil palm plantations. It's not a win-win in equal terms. The win of peasants is rarely a win for big corporations. Think of agroecological method of agriculture or of food sovereignty, an agriculture and food system that have not much need of big industrial corporations. RRR are reforms that make many of us feel uncomfortable and awkward because this requires us to ask big and act insurgent. These are never neat and always messy, never conformist and inherently subversive. RRR can only be successful in the long run if it's carried out within a broader democratic, agricultural, socio-economic, and socio-ecological system. Food sovereignty, maybe, but we can always kind of debate on that later. Defaulting on these bigger system-wide reforms, socio-economic, socio-ecological, will contribute to further strengthening of problematic strands of populism, right-wing and authoritarian strands of populism that we have seen mushrooming in the world today, that are exploiting the same issues and grievances of the forgotten, pushed aside, looked down, ridiculed, neglected, left behind people, many of whom are from the countryside, to advance their problematic agenda, and sections of the rural world are gambling with them because of the series of broken promises to them before. What all this imply, among others, is to invest in supporting efforts to, 1, facilitate the emergence of social justice movements where they are absent, 2, strengthening them where they are weak, 3, helping them to expand where they are already strong but with limited spread, plus in helping reshape the political opportunity structure in their favor, elite allies within and outside the state, favorable institutional reforms, allies in academic community, etc. There are multiple ways of doing this, and coming back to the conference's theme of evidence engagement policy, I think Esther Turnhout already talked about the different ways, approaches of doing these things, including multi-stakeholdership and the problems of those. I would say that there's another one, a smaller kind of tradition, which is called the scholar activism kind of tradition. By scholar activists, I mean those who explicitly aim not only to interpret the world in various scholarly ways, but who also aim to change it and change it towards greater social justice, and who are connected unapologetically to political projects or social justice movements. How do we work as scholars with movements for social justice? The social movement scholar from New York, Francis Fox Piven, explains the contradictions between scholars attempting to work with social movement activists to push for deep social reforms, and that this working relationship is full of tension. She said, the tension arises when we commit ourselves to the more troubling sorts of demands that advance the interests and ideas of groups that are at the margins of public life, the people who are voiceless, degraded, and exploited. When we commit ourselves to the often disorderly movements that try to advance the political causes of these groups, when we join our critiques of the institutional arrangements like land policies, etc., that the movements are trying to change, to commit ourselves to the movement itself. It is this sort of divided commitment between an academic career and dissident activism that provokes reflection on how to do both. A good activist is irreverent, subversive, and passionate, at least in Sol Alinsky's definition. And a good academic, which many of us here are, is supposed to be prim, respectful, and clinical, at least in this stereotype profile. These contradictory qualities are what define scholar activists. This leads to a permanent tension and contradiction faced by them. The challenge for scholar activists in dealing with requirements of academic work can be seen in at least 2 ways, and it brings us to the theme of the conference of evidence engagement policies. It's a question of rigor and impact. Rigor and impact for scholar activism always have 2 dimensions. The academic interpretation of rigor, peer review processes, top academic journals, jury evaluating your midterm evaluation of your projects, and so on and so forth. And also the political rigor. For activists, the political rigor, we don't do CSI work. We don't do CSI work. Crime scene investigation, which is like a post-mortem dissection of the problem. How did this body die? As scholar activists, don't do that. We deal with live bodies, and try to intervene and change the course of history, and not explaining a past kind of death. So it's not easy to talk about that kind of thing. And impact, of course, is even more problematic discussion. Academic impact, we all talk about the impact factor of journals. Where do we don't want to publish in that journal because it's just below 1.0 impact factor. We go for this one because it's 2.5, it's required by the National Science Foundation, et cetera, et cetera. Political impact is also different things. The question is that, did the research help stop the construction of dam that would submerge 11 villages? Those are very difficult kind of choices we all make. In conclusion, and going back to the question of land policies, on researching the deeply political, inherently messy issues of social justice, land policies, these are difficult, but it's difficult but necessary to ask big and act insurgent. Anything short of these will only result in more of the same, and poor people are getting tired of this cycle of broken promises. The fact that they are already gambling with problematic right-wing populist projects. One of the most effective relevant approaches for academics is to do research on these issues from a scholar activist tradition. But this means more complicated and difficult ways of doing research. But it can be complementary to other approaches and can be quite rewarding academically and politically. Thank you.
You want everyone to come here now? Okay. So I'm going to invite our debaters and our keynote speakers to come here. Before I take the questions, I do want to just wrap up a bit, because I think we've had two very impressive and very different keynote presentations with very different visions of how we move towards governance of conflicted natural resources. And I hope this will allow our debaters and the floor to be as provocative and to comment on the two perspectives we've seen. On the one hand, I think Professor Ellis's presentation was focused much more on the Anthropocene and on the ecological lens, whereas we saw with Professor Borras looking much more at the land, natural resources, but the land side of natural resources and the challenges of reform in that sector. I think if I can, I'm not sure if I've concluded this right, but I think on the one hand, Professor Ellis's view is that if we work with existing systems, particularly those urbanized systems, and work to try and make sure that we conserve our biodiversity, our biosphere, he gave two examples that I thought were interesting, allowing these migration corridors to exist or allowing different types of biodiversity to exist, like we saw in your example in Africa, that we can actually address a lot of our global challenges. And I think the key message from Professor Borras was, without major political reform, it's just going to be business as usual, and we're not going to change the current trajectory. And I thought he gave some very good concrete solutions, the one being this idea of a ceiling and a floor for land allocations, and then, which I thought it was very concrete and practical, so thank you for that, because I asked for that. But then much more broadly speaking, this idea of redistribution, restitution, and recognition as being the basis for moving forward. And without that, any action we try and do, and I think he made reference to some of the land governance reform processes that are currently underway, are not going to fundamentally change the inequalities that exist and the poverty that exists in the world. I would like the two debaters, I will introduce you briefly, and then I'd like you to respond to what's being said. So be provocative. Choose to respond to the person you disagreed with most, and then we will open the floor. So I will start with Dzodzi Tsikata, who is the director of the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana. Prior to this, she was based at the Institute of Statistical, Social, and Economic Research, where she was deputy director and director of the Center for Gender Studies and Advocacy at the University of Ghana. And our other debater today is Pascal Peduzzi, who is director of GRID Geneva at the United Nations Environment Program in Geneva, and a professor in the Department of Geography and Environment at the University of Geneva. I'm going to hand over to you first. Thank you. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the two speakers for their presentations, both of which I found really interesting and had me reacting quite a bit in my mind. I would like first to say to June that many of the issues he has raised are issues that I've been intimately concerned with, and I'd like to agree with him on many of his recommendations, and also the requests that scholars also focus on activism. I want to draw attention to the fact that feminist scholars have been doing this for a very long time, and it will be good for movements which are not necessarily feminist to pay attention to how feminist scholars have straddled that tension. Many of the things you've said are also important in the way in which we do our research. You've been speaking about governments and government policies and so on. But as a researcher, I'd like to address some of the challenges I find in the growing body of literature about land and natural resource grabbing. As you know, this body of work has grown in many directions, and its underlying focus has been on governance of natural resource issues, but it's never been very uppermost. So I'm very glad that this session is talking about the governance of land and water for agriculture, forests, wood and non-wood products, the commons, minerals, and oil and gas. And we can see that in some of the research. One of the areas of debate about Africa, which I want to focus on, is whether Africa has been susceptible to land grabbing because of its weak governance institutions. Beyond the rights and wrongs of this debate, I think it has never been made quite explicit what we mean by good governance. And this is what I want to talk about, because it seems to be that the dominant approach to resource governance has tended to focus on processes, making institutions stronger, processes which are open, respect the rule of law, allow participation, and so on, and much less on the outcomes. And it was June's presentation was focusing a bit more on those outcomes, which are really important. And this is not to say that process is not important. I think process helps the kinds of movements that June was talking about that are very critical to change. It allows citizens to have a voice and so on. But if we do not focus on outcomes, we then have these sterile processes which lead to all sorts of outcomes. I was struck by Erle's map about the lighted Africa, the lighted globe, and I wanted to point out that Africa was not lighted. And so his very positive vision of urbanization and what urban populations can do disturbed me, because urbanization in Africa is mostly demographic and has not changed the livelihoods of people for the better. So I'm not sure that the African urban populations can actually participate in making the kinds of decisions that he has pointed out need to be made about how we should govern our globe. Secondly, I think he's right when he talks about the fact that there will be land use conflicts if we think of the multi-use of environments. And I think he put that very well. And he showed the biodiversity in Africa and the populations that live around biodiversity. Again, this is one area where one has to pay attention to the points June made about the winners and the losers in these kinds of arrangements. Because much often, governments have all sorts of biases in the ways in which they look at these issues of natural resource governance. They have a bias in favor of sedentary people, a bias in favor of formalized processes, in favor of large scale, in favor of people with ownership documents and so on. And these biases are against women, pastoralists, people who use common property resources, and so on. So it's very important to look at the winners and losers in the use of multiple environments if we are not to perpetuate the inequalities and the problems. The last point I want to make is that if we take a large view of natural resource governance and also focus on its outcomes, then I think it allows us a broader canvas on which to do our research. Our research questions become deeper because it raises questions such as the way ownership of resources is looked at. If you look at the ownership of resources in Africa these days, public ownership now has been truncated to mean controlled by the government. The fact that they are fiduciaries in this arena, and that they should be working in favor of citizen owners, is completely lost. And traditional leaders are also caught up in that bind. We also realize that the frameworks for management, which are being promoted, also by the aid agencies and so on, focus on how to manage Africa's natural resources so that foreign investors can be comfortable in Africa. There's very little being said about agricultural tenancies, which is the life of the majority of people. Very little being said about small-scale miners and how they can make a living from Africa's mining resources and so on. So one needs to be able to pay a bit more attention to that. The last point I want to make, because I've run out of time, is that when we have a very narrow view of governance as process, we forget the fact that one needs to pay attention to the purposes of governance. We are trying to have good governance so that Africa's resources can improve livelihoods in Africa, but most importantly, can structurally transform Africa from its economic dependence on commodities and become diversified, industrialized, and be able to make a living for its people. And therefore, we need to be interested, for example, in how well natural resource governance promotes the diversification of economies and their structural transformation, and allows minerals and natural resources to actually become vehicles for the transformation of lives and livelihoods. Thank you very much.
Yes, good morning, everybody. It's a privilege and honor to be here. I also have been very fascinated by those two presentations, and it's going to be very difficult to debate, but Carin said that we really have to. So for the sake of it, I will find some points where I think we have some different angles. But really, I was very impressed by the presentations of both, and I'll start with Erle's presentation on the Anthropocene. I think this is absolutely the debate, whereas the Anthropocene has started in the prehistorical time, or if it started with the Industrial Revolution, or if it started in 1950, is not necessarily relevant, because we are in the Anthropocene, and that's what it is. It's unbelievable the amount of material that we are using in the natural forces that shape our Earth, with preliminary glaciers and rivers that together are carrying 24 tons of material, 24 billion tons of material per year. But now the humans are mining, transforming, transporting about twice this amount. So we became humans the major forces of transformation of planet Earth. And just the amount of sand that we are using, about 30 to 40 billion tons of sand for building roads, dams, land reclamation on the sea, many usage of sand. In fact, sand is everywhere in this room. It's unbelievable how much we are using. It's 30 billion tons. It doesn't, it's huge, big, but how big is it? It's enough to build a wall of 20 meters by 20 meters all around the equator every year. That's the amount of sand that we are using. And you cannot do this kind of transformation at such an impact without having a huge impact on the environment. So why I would disagree is, yes, we've done something in the past. Well, our ancestors in prehistoric time, we killed the megafauna. But they did that over hundreds of thousands of years. Whereas in between 2010 and 2013 only, humans have killed 100,000 elephants. In the year 2011 only, 1 elephant out of 12 has been killed. That's the acceleration that we see. And in fact, if you look at all the tendencies since 1950, we see a great acceleration of the Anthropocene. And this is the acceleration that is really, really fascinating in one way, but absolutely scary, because we have made this development possible by using not the interest for natural resources, but really by taking on the capital. So now we have three issues, three big challenges that we need to solve with our governance. First is how are we going to bring up all the human well-being for the poorest? And because with all the impact that we've done, we still haven't managed to make a decent life for billions of people. So with this challenge of the Sustainable Development Goals, how are we going to achieve those goals within the few years that we have to achieve them without puncturing more on the capital? Because that's the point number two. We have to respect the planetary boundaries, and Professor Rockström showed that we have exceeded several of these boundaries already. The biodiversity, climate change, nitrogen, we're talking about fertilizing and agriculture, we have exceeded this boundary as well. So how are we going to bring up this population in need while we still have to decrease our footprint on the natural resources? And third, we have to do that within an increasing population. We will be at least 9.5 billion people in 2050. Yes, it is slowing down in most of the continent, but the African population will double by 2050. So this is the challenge that we have to deal with, is those three challenges. Now, how are we going to do that with the tools that we have in terms of governance? We've made great success. 2015 was unbelievable with the SDGs signed in New York, the COP21 in Paris. We had the HE targets and lots of things that we've been improving recently. So those are progresses. And in fact, we see that photovoltaic panels are now producing cheaper electricity than coal in 60 developing countries. So this is a real achievement. On the land grabbing, this is a fascinating subject because it is about the last control of land and imposed by multinationals. And I find it, I totally agree with what you said, so I can't be very controversial. I would just add a few examples. One of them is the conversion of mangroves into shrimp farms and fish farms. And we see here a lot of contracts between the local community that used to be fishing in this area and multinationals who are exporting shrimps for us to have good cocktails. Now, these fishermen are losing the fishes because the mangroves where the fishes are reproducing themselves are disappearing. And so we have this conflict between multinational and local, bringing a lot of social issues, but also these ecosystems were producing more economy when they were intact as mangroves by the renewing of the fish population, by the protection of the shoreline and erosion, by regulating carbon absorption and so on and so forth, crabs for foods. And in fact, replacing them by shrimp farms is decreasing their productivity. So here we have an impact on decreased productivity. The second example is when I'm offering flowers to my wife. You know, it's good, you want to show your love. But 10% of those flowers are produced in Ethiopia and Kenya. Now, we have the worst famine and the worst drought affecting this region. And how come it be a gesture of love to offer flowers to the dear one when you are actually depriving local communities from food possibilities? You know, why flowers is just going to be cut and put there, nice, but nobody is going to eat that. So it's a waste of resources, although I love flowers, don't get me wrong, but it's no longer a gesture of love to deprive taking the most fertile soils in Ethiopia and Kenya for exporting flowers in Europe. So that's, I think it's one of the challenges that we have to reconcile, is really to have a shift in the way that we are dealing with our agriculture. And the fertilizers, it's good productivity, but you need 1 calorie, for 1 calorie of food, you need 9 to 12 calories of fertilizer, pesticides, and so on. So I think in terms of yield, we're not really making a lot of progress there, and I think we need to better turn back to other alternative way of food production. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of you, and thank you for being provocative. I think that was really interesting. I'm going to now read some questions from the audience, which are also quite provocative. I'm going to start, there's a bunch of questions to Professor Ellis and then a few to Professor Jun. So I'm going to say those and then I'm going to give you all a last chance to speak. We are going to cut a little bit into our break time because we did start a bit late. So thank you for your patience. So to Professor Ellis, we have a few questions, okay? So I'm going to read them out. If you just note them down and then you can respond at the end. So from Bishnu Petrie from Nepal, he says, commercial interests of multinational companies dominate global processes and weaken conservation. In such a situation, how can we conserve biodiversity? Sabine writes, seriously, the wolf? In Switzerland, the animal symbolizes the urban-rural divide like no other, pointing to the fact that ecological change is hugely cultural. An anonymous question also to Professor Ellis, how does conserving the 50% that you mentioned include the interests of indigenous communities embedded in those areas? How do we prevent conservational post-colonialism? Another one from Sabine says, I feel uncomfortable with the term novel. Doesn't it invoke the idea of virgin spaces that can be occupied and exploited? From Tumtone Vongvisu, sorry for the pronunciation, how much natural resources were used for fast development, i.e. in the case of China? And what recommendation would you like to make for other developing countries? Okay, those are the questions to Professor Ellis. And to Professor Jun, so again, from Bishnu Petrie from Nepal, he says, are there any successful examples of democratic land governance to address the problems of the global land rush? And from Elizabeth Berge, what is the role, I think this is to you, Professor Jun, what is the role of spatial planning to realize the ceilings of land concentration? Is there a need for an internationally recognized principle for spatial planning? And then from Ibrahima Hatti, are the FAO voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of land tenure a valid tool to achieve the outcomes such as those targeted by RRR? And then to Sabine, thanks Jun, sparking hope by insisting on what we often like to gloss over, class antagonism. Tell us more about how we negotiate our own being implicated. Tell us more about how we negotiate our own, like our own ourselves, I guess, being implicated in this class antagonism. Okay, so they were questions to Professor Ellis and Professor Jun, but if the two of you would like to respond to some of the points, please do. I would like all four of you to end with one key issue or challenge that you would like the audience to reflect on today as we go through the day's events and the different sessions. So ending off your answers with one key issue or challenge. Thank you.
Okay, wow, all right. Oh, sorry about that. Yes. Is it on? Hello, yes. Thanks. Those are great questions. The first one, I think, is very relevant to this telecoupling idea, right? That we do have huge corporate interests that are dominating a lot of the resource flows globally. And how does that influence biodiversity, or what to say about that? I think it's very simple. If those commercial interests don't reflect the interests of people, just these corporate interests, then they're going to do things that we don't want them to do. And therefore, it's on us to make sure that they do have responsibility and accountability for everything that they do, and that we put pressure on them. But the idea that they're going to just go away, or that you're going to have bananas in the winter without corporate interests trading things around the world is very unlikely. We kind of depend on a lot of, we're internationally connected, and individuals have a hard time doing that. It does require some form of other entity to do that. But if those entities are not accountable, and they often are not, then it's a real problem. And it's one of the reasons we have a lot of the problems we have now. I would say, and actually to respond to your first summary of what I was talking about, I would not characterize what I'm talking about as business as usual. In fact, there's no possibility that the, quote, business as usual, at least this great acceleration model for development, is going to roll back a lot of development and enable a 50%, a half-Earth scenario. There's no way to do it in that scenario. So no, business as usual definitely does not characterize what I'm talking about. Ecological change is cultural with respect to the wolf. Absolutely. That was my main point. And if you want the wolf back, if you want any species back that are hard to live with, which is a lot of species, right? We don't actually need a lot of those species to get by on a day-to-day basis. No matter how much we want to talk about ecosystem services to humanity or what it will take to conserve nature, we're already using the ones we like the most. And that's the reason why we use so much land for monoculture, is because it actually is very productive for humans and not that productive for the others. And so if we want those others back, it's not going to come from the same old culture, which is just agriculture. The half-Earth and indigenous land rights. Well, one of the simplest findings of data-driven conservation is that indigenous people in general do a better job of conserving biodiversity than just about any other land management system that we've seen. And I brought up the example of the Maasai rangelands. I mean, those remain the most biodiverse as far as megafauna assemblages. So obviously, I think the two are highly aligned. I think the idea for massive recovery of indigenous land as part of such a process is, I would say, embedded in the whole idea. Novel equals virgin. I mean, that's a novel interpretation. I would never, in fact, the whole concept of novel ecosystems emerged, and it's not my idea, it's Richard Hobbs, another ecologist, restoration ecologist, was to counter this idea of some kind of virgin ecology. There is no virgin ecology. And the idea that novel ecosystems, by calling something a novel ecosystem, you're setting it up for expropriation by other people, I think, I definitely doesn't include anything I've ever seen. I definitely don't support that. I don't think it necessarily has any connection. China and resources and recommendations for other developing countries. So China is a very interesting example of development because they have pulled more people out of poverty than any other country in the world. All right? So if you're talking about pulling people out of poverty, the Chinese have done it at a larger scale and faster than any other country on earth. And they've done it at a cost. Right? Their environment is very damaged in many different ways. There's a lot of reasons why it's difficult to live in Beijing, and one of them is the air is almost unbreathable. All right? So they are paying these prices in the environment. Do people want to go back to 1970 and before the development began to explode? You will not find anyone who wants to go back to those earlier times for multiple reasons, but one of them is that they actually prefer to have more wealth and resources accessible to them. It's not mean it's totally even. Even China's a big country. There's a lot of poor people, very poor people still living in China. So it's not perfect. But as an example of pulling people out of poverty, it's a good example. And in fact, just to close on that, one thing I thought was really interesting is that when I was looking at June's slide about the RRR, I was thinking that was just Chinese development in the 1950s through the 1970s, pretty much. I mean, land reforms and all that, it was very similar. And I don't know if everyone wants to go through that. You could never go through it exactly what they did, but the idea that, when you start to develop a modern economy, which was the goal of China, was to develop in a modern society with proletariats, not just peasants, but you have to start somewhere. And they started where they were, which was everyone was a poor landless peasant pretty much, or most people were. And so they saw that as the beginning. First, you build a stable platform where people can feed themselves, and building on that, you can educate and move on to other stages. And that the other final stages, China's plan was always to go there. Are you going to get development beyond a stable agrarian society if you don't visualize that and make that part of your plan from the beginning? You can't just, the end all and be all is not a stable agrarian small-scale society, I don't think. I mean, it depends on different perspectives. Some people have a different point of view, but I think the majority of people, and I think most Chinese people would agree, staying, small-scale in the countryside is not the long-term vision for the family in 50 years, say. There's another vision. All right, thank you. Oh, the key issue and challenge. Yeah, my key issue and challenge, I'm very curious about what people here think about this, which is moving biodiversity conservation out of technocracy. It's not a planetary boundary issue at all. That will never motivate anyone to conserve biodiversity. How do you get people who are struggling on a day-to-day level, who are trying to pull themselves out of poverty, how do you make room in their lives, a little bit, just the right amount, not too much, right? People have priorities. But how can you build a bigger vision about what they're working for in the long term? What is their aspirational nature? Can that become part of a larger effort to conserve biodiversity through the Anthropocene? I'm just curious, where's the point where people can be engaged like that in the appropriate way?
Well, I don't have much disagreement with everything that Dzodzi said. And especially she pointed out one very important point about, is it that much of the land grabs are happening in Africa because Africa has weak governance kind of thing, which is a prevalent kind of discourse. And I think that's very easy to kind of raise some problematic kind of questions about that because, well, even in European Union, EU 27, we know that there's creeping land grabs inside the EU, that even the European Parliament has already started to investigate what's going on. And you can not say that, oh, that's happening because there's weak governance in the European Union or something like that. Well, in Canada, there's now a lot of controversies about the so-called land grabs going on in Ontario and Saskatoon and etc. So the point is that it's everywhere. It's truly universal and global, this land grabs phenomenon. It's a global rush. It's a global land rush. It's very different from the 1850s localized land rush in Oklahoma, for instance. This is more of like a more globalized, and it cuts across different kinds of political settings. It's more of capital goes wherever they could make profit. We always put China as the biggest land grabbers, and no one talks about that. Actually, China is probably the biggest land grab country in the world, with about 45 million peasants expropriated between 1978 and early 1990s throughout about 2005, where about 80,000 land conflicts erupt every year. That kind of thing, for instance, that it's everywhere. It's all about where capital accumulation would go and estimate that they could make a killing in terms of profit by grabbing control over land. So thanks, Dzodzi, for raising that. I agree completely with you. Are there examples of democratic land governance that worked? Well, history told us that that is so. I think most of the industrialized Western countries have started taking off with their national economies, with more or less more egalitarian kind of access to and control of resources in different ways. They have different. It's not just the Mao era of 1949 confiscatory land reform that tells us that it can work. It does work in liberal democracies, for instance. In many different settings historically. And so on and so forth. Have there been something in the contemporary land rush? Well, I always think of my country, the Philippines. Earlier, it was reported to be among the most land grab country in the world, only to be realized that it was wrong. Early on, all companies were rushing to the Philippines. They thought that they could grab lands there, and it was reported that half of our total agricultural lands were grabbed by foreigners. It turned out that they were there, and then they all pulled out. They realized that the land reform that was implemented in 1988 all the way to present facilitated the distribution of land awards to about 3 million peasants. And it's that too cumbersome for them to aggregate small pieces of land. So that one is like, actually the Philippines was bypassed to a large extent during the peak period of land rush. Well, today they're coming back and using many other different ways in the gray area of public lands. But that's one thing. Vietnam, whatever you say, there are some problems about land confiscation by the state here and there, but it's not as bad as Myanmar, for instance. And part of that is that somehow it works there of the minimum access. Most households, not all, who wanted to work the land, they have even the very small plots of land. When we talk about small plots of land in Vietnam, it's really small, like really small, but they have access to food gardens, and it matters quite a bit. Spatial planning for land size ceiling, I think it's very important. The multidimensional aspect of land size ceiling. It's not just political, although political is very important in determining that, but spatial planning would be quite important to that. The FAO 10-year guidelines is a very misunderstood and underappreciated instrument. Actually, it's a way much more powerful than many of the critics would project it to be. It's all. The problem is that the term voluntary guidelines, they thought it's like voluntary, but actually if we look deeper, because it implicates international treaties on human rights and many other things, it is much more stronger than human rights. Can it provide completely for the RRR? Probably not. Ultimately, the RRR would be within the realm of national states and national political venues where the struggle for national laws for those will be fought. Class antagonisms and how we are implicated there. Well, we as scholars, we have political context in our everyday life and our everyday work. And sometimes we are asked in a multi-stakeholdership platform, for instance, we always think about what will I do in this participation or my research? Will it reinforce corporate interest here at the detriment of the villagers, or will it strengthen the villagers' quest for social justice? I think always asking and always framing, always conscious of our political context and always asking and striving to contribute to greater social justice is an important task that we can do, even when we are not peasants, but we identify with the working poor in our everyday life, in our everyday work.
Just one key challenge.
Land governance ultimately entails procedures and processes. Multi-stakeholder dialogues, face-to-face dialogues, alliances, clear cadastral records, and all those things. They are very important, but secondary. Ultimately, land governance is deeply political, and it requires deep social reforms. Backing away from those big questions will be self-defeating and will just perpetuate these cycles of broken promises that poor people now are showing that they are sick and tired of those cycles of broken promises that they've been forgotten, neglected, pushed aside, left behind, taken for granted, and they want change, and they are now gambling with problematic right-wing populists. And we might not want that to continue to happen, and we might want to start to ask big and act insurgent.
I just want to say an additional word about voluntary guidelines. I agree with June that they've been very useful, but they clearly cannot substitute state regulation and the establishment of proper systems of governing natural resources within countries which are facing so many crises of natural resources. And it's really important that we do not substitute voluntary guidelines for what countries need to do for themselves. What I would like to leave you with is to reiterate a point I made earlier on, that if we want to measure our research and development efforts around natural resource governance, we have to ask how well they are attending to both the means and the ends for building a democratic natural resource governance system. And that system is not only for citizens to participate in their own exploitation as a formality or as something that is a duty, but to ensure that the Earth's resources are managed in ways that benefit the many and not the few, and that they do not reinforce cycles of impoverishment, desperation, and the widening gap between rich and poor people and nations. I think it's the minimum we could do as scholars. Thank you very much.
Okay, one answer on the biodiversity thing, and then my final comment. How do we can interest people on biodiversity? We are much more dependent on biodiversity than most people think. And if it's for the climate on forest, we really need to do reforestation to absorb this carbon. Also for the rain, we know that without forest, the rain tends to decline. So there's lots of connection that we need to highlight with the biodiversity. Pollinators, we are totally dependent for 33% of our main crops on pollinations. That bees are doing that for free for us, and as a reward, we just put some pesticides on them. So we really have to change this way we are behaving with the biodiversity, because we are part of it, and that's what you were saying. We are now the Anthropocene biodiversity. It's an interlinked. In fact, it has always been, but now we really depend on the remaining bit, which is much smaller. On the key points, I'm not an economist. I guess there are several of them in this room, and we need a new way of dealing with the economy. An economy that has led to 1% having 50% of the wealth in the world is not a fair economy. An economy that is linear, going from extracting and mining stuff, producing that in industry for consumers, and then dump for waste, is no longer sustainable, has never been, in fact. So we need to come back to a circular economy, to where the traditional economy was circular. We need to reinvent a circular economy, and that would be my take-home message. How can we move toward a circular economy where the waste is no longer a waste, but is the resources? Because that's the only way we can reduce our footprint on the natural resources. We cannot, being sustainable means like forever. So as the economist Kenneth Boulding was saying in the 50s, you cannot, if you believe in continuous growth in a finite world, you're either a fool or an economist. It's true, we have just one planet. So sustainability means that you cannot touch the capital. So you have to invest in that natural capital to have more fishes, because a bigger fish population will give you more fisheries. You have to live on the interest. And more forests will give you more timber as an interest. But we can't continue to grab the capital. So that's my final talk. I really need economists to reinvent a circular economy.
Okay, I think we can give them all a round of applause. Thank you for your very diverse and interesting and stimulating inputs. We're now moving to a coffee break. Would the organizers like to take the floor before I let people go? No? Okay, so thanks for participating and for all your great questions, and now there'll be a coffee break. Thank you.